मैं अपनी बात की शुरुआत इरा जी से ही करना चाहूँगा, इस वजह से भी कि थोड़ा सा वो ऐतिहासिक परिप्रेक्ष्य अगर हम इस पूरी बातचीत को दे पाएँ हालिया सिनेमा पे आने से पहले। अगर हम पिछले 90 साल का इतिहास देखें तो अलग अलग छवियाँ हमें मिलती हैं। एक हंटर वाली की छवि है, एक मदर इंडिया की छवि है, एक कामकाजी स्त्री की छवि है जो कि पैरेलल सिनेमा के अंदर या मिडिल ऑफ द रोड सिनेमा के अंदर आती है, एक आइटम गर्ल की छवि है, एक तवायफ की छवि है जो कि उसी पूरे राष्ट्रवादी सिनेमा के बीच में कहीं आती है और उसको प्रश्नांकित करने का काम करती है। और हालिया फिल्मों के अंदर बहुत सारी ऐसी छवियां हैं जो कि हम देख रहे हैं। तो आपको अगर मैं ये कहूँ कि इनमें कुछ ऐसी चीज़ें अगर रेखांकित करनी हो जो आपको बहुत अच्छी लगती हैं, प्रोग्रेसिव लगती हैं, जिनको देख के आपको लगता है कि हाँ यहाँ पे स्त्री छवि बदल रही है, कहीं आगे जा रही है, और साथ में कोई ऐसी भी छवि है जिसको देख के आपको लगता है कि नहीं ये एक कदम आगे नहीं, एक कदम पीछे की तरफ जा रहा है, तो आप क्या कहेंगी?
Shukriya Mihir. Also, I'd like to thank Rachna and Hans for this opportunity. I'm sorry, but I'm going to speak in English. I hope that's okay. प्रश्न तो आपके बहुत सारे हैं एंड आपने तो पूरा मतलब इंडियन सिनेमा, स्पेशली बॉम्बे सिनेमा का इतिहास पूछ लिया मेरे से. So it's a little difficult to do that in 5 minutes. But what I'll do is I'm going to focus on 2-3 moments of cinema. And the first is pre-independence. It's not after 1947. It's before. It's the first 2 decades of sound cinema. Our first sound film was in 1931, Alamara. And from then to 1947 के जो साल हैं बहुत ही दिलचस्प है. And the reason for that is also very interesting. The reason for that is that this was also the height of the national movement. And मैं बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं जाऊँगी उसमें, but one of the key arguments that Partho Chatterjee has made, the historian Partho Chatterjee has made, is that the women's question, क्योंकि early 20th century में the reformers had raised the issue of women's reform, the reform and the fact that women should get educated. So the women's question was suddenly resolved in favor of nationalism. So whatever progressive aspects of the early reform movements that could have been seen at the turn of the century suddenly were lost because they were amalgamated in the question of nationalism, where women had a particular kind of role. और जैसे आप कह रहे हैं कि त्याग वाली और संस्कृति, the embodiment of culture, Indian culture, वो वाला रोल उनके लिए आप पढ़ लीजिए, लिख लीजिए, लेकिन आपका एक ही रोल है which is to produce good national citizens, और आपका एक ही रोल है which is to do त्याग for the nation. ये वाला मतलब कुछ ideology था. Now the interesting thing is that in those 15, 16, 18 years from 1931 to 47, 48, even up to 50, what was Bombay cinema doing? And also some other language cinemas. Since I haven't done so much research in other language cinemas in India, Bombay cinemas, Hindustani language cinema जो produce हुआ था, उसके बहुत interesting कुछ aspects हैं, और वो ये हैं कि the women's question is looked at in those films made by men. All those films were made by men. They were actually struggling with what is the women's issue, what are women's issues, and what does she represent, and what are those issues that are unsaid, repressed in our society. And in the same context, I'd like to quickly mention the role of women's journals. Journals started by men. I'll give you 2 examples, Stree Darpan and Chand. Stree Darpan was started in 1909. It went on till 29. Chand was started in the 20s, went up to the 40s. And then, of course, in 1930 was Hans, the first phase of Hans. Now, the role of these journals, they were, of course, the women who were writing in these were middle-class women. So, definitely, there was a particular class structure there. But what is very interesting is that what we saw in these journals, in the essays that these women were writing, there were 2 questions that were raised repeatedly. One, of course, had to do with, women's role in politics, in the national movement, and what role could women play in society. That was a very important question. And उनकी विचार, उनकी opinions वगैरह उसमें व्यक्त हो रहे थे. The other very, very important question, and which was very important for the cinema of the time, was what Francesca Orsini has called the right to feel. Women's right to feel. And also that in the short stories that were published in these, what we had is a mise-en-scène of desire, of women's desire. And this is what I want to actually talk about before we come to independence and before we come to Mother India and so on, which is that those are, films in which the narrative resolution, matlab ending of the film may be very conservative, the woman may be punished for whatever she does or says or feels, but those films expressed for the first time what was not allowed to women in society. For instance, there's a wonderful film, of course, everyone knows about Achut Kanya. Okay? Now, Achut Kanya, the role played by Devika Rani, and I'm not going on makeup and all, and of course she was a huge star and she didn't look like a Dalit woman and all of that. But she, in Achut Kanya, what remains in your mind is not the sacrifice of this girl. She, of course, the narrative has to make her die, right? What remains in your mind is her desire for the man she loves, who's a Brahmin. That remains. And what is the madhyam? किस माध्यम से वो व्यक्त किया जाता है? Songs. Through songs. And therefore the song of Bombay cinema, the songs of Indian cinemas, different language cinemas, the songs are really important because it is through the songs that that which is not allowed was allowed to be articulated. Okay, so what we are left with is the impression of Devika Rani, her desire for Pratap, that's the Brahmin boy, and her recognition that it's an impossible desire, and the grief that she articulates through the songs that she sings. For this, the historical moment of the birth of the woman's desire hasn't arrived yet, and hence she has to sacrifice that. That's one example. There's another very wonderful example from another social film 15 years later called Tarana with Madhubal, and I'm talking about mainstream cinema here. And then I was telling Mihir the other day about an absolutely fabulous rendering of both the Laila Majnu and the Heer story, Heer Ranjha story. And there is a film from 1956, I think it is, called Heer with Nutan and Pradeep Kumar. Usme jo critique hai of patriarchy and the constrictions, restrictions on the woman. She's speaking as Heer, Nutan is speaking as Heer, and the passion with which she says, "Jala dungi main ye puri duniya ko," and she does, because of course it's a melodramatic idiom of these films, and refuses to give in. So the question of women's desire was always a form of deviancy in that period. The woman who desired and who articulated her desire was a deviant woman, and had to be punished. But what remains with you is the image of that woman articulating that forbidden desire. So this is the early period. Of course, post independence, a lot of the portrayals, and then from 60s onwards, things change. You have the Mother India kind of moment where, Nargis is the nation, has to perform the role of what the new nation means, the morality of that nation, etc., etc. And yet, then you have the 60s period where there is the arrival of color and the aspiration for the West. All of that happens in the 1960s cinema, and then comes the new wave, the moment of the new wave, in which, of course, Ratnaji has also had an important role in a film like Mirch Masala and other work, and 80s, no, but it was, however, it is the new wave, and I'm not talking of middle cinema, but the new wave, which began actually with one of the first films was Sara Akash, Rajendra Yadav ki kahani pe jo Basu Chatterjee ne banai thi. And actually Basu Chatterjee, the The form of Sara Akash, which was very experimental, he never returned to that after that first film. His next film was Rajnigandha, based on a story by Manu Bhandari. But the form of Basu Chatterjee had changed, it had become quite commercial. So Sara Akash is a phenomenal film of that moment, which along with Uski Roti and Bhuvan Shom, etc., launched the new wave. Now, what happened with the new wave was the portrayal of women, largely speaking, was that of the oppressed woman. Very few films in the new wave were about women with agency. There was, of course, later film Mirch Masala is a good film for that reason. Yeah, and also, something like Mrityu Dand that came later, that was also a very important film. But largely speaking, the focus of these filmmakers was on oppression, on the oppression of women, which had to be foregrounded. So those were the kinds of films that were being made, and there were a few which actually gave agency to women. So, and middle cinema, which is the cinema that fell in between the commercial mainstream cinema and the new wave cinema, which is known as the middle cinema, which was very popular, had lovely songs, great performances, etc., etc. But they were films that were often compromised in the take that they had on women. Women were often in those films pushed back into very traditional kinds of roles. There is one genre, and since Mihir has already mentioned it, I do want to mention that, and it's a commercial, a mainstream film genre, and that's the courtesan film. So whether you look at Pakiza or Umrajan, or the figure of the courtesan, what this figure did, and that is why she was a thorn in the side of respectable society, because she constantly questioned the rules of patriarchy, the structures, the hierarchical structures within which she was an outsider, she was marginalized. And this was a form, of course, all the big A-list stars, female stars, wanted to be in the courtesan film because it was a great opportunity for performance, right? This was a genre of the mainstream that also raised questions about women's oppression and also allowed agency to women to take certain kinds of decisions and act upon those. And then, of course, there is the contemporary moment in which lots of things change. There is also, of course, a lot of conservatism in popular cinema. The roles for women weren't that great, but then in current cinema, there's a lot of work that has come out which has been very, very phenomenal, but maybe that in the next round. I think I should stop now. Thank you. So my daughter always tells me that माँ को माइक पकड़ा दो लेक्चर देने लगती हैं.
बहुत शुक्रिया.